BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Raven Smith. Welcome to this abridged version of Raven Smith's Men. I put pen to paper to trace the roots of my masculinity, trying to distill what it is about men that has kept me enthralled and irritated my entire life. I love men, but men are problematic. I also happen to be one. I recount as many of my men as possible, from school jocks, teenage kicks, right through the thicket of my 20s and out the other side. Obviously, my dad is in there, as is my long-suffering husband. Talking about men can get very serious very fast, but before we page Dr. Freud, it's worth mentioning I've had a lot of laughs and a handful of orgasms. Lucky me! Join me as I paint the portrait of my life lived in parallel with other men. I am as curious as I am terrified. Expect sex, expect drugs, expect strong language and bad decisions. Episode 1. Men. Herein lie the men of Raven Smith. My men, of course, not yours. Each of them has left a mark, a memory, whether they meant to or not. Some hit deep and I caught all the feels. Some I discarded like a clip-on necktie. Some I know by blood, others by employment. These chaps have either wound me up or let me down, wheedling their way under my skin or pleasantly granted access. Maybe the guy was funny, or tall, or implausibly charming. Maybe he left me breathless, or left me cold. Some of them clapped my cheeks, while others clapped themselves on their backs. There are stepdads and actual dads, and some who just wanted to be called daddy. I still don't know the exact criteria for inclusion in this book, what made me commit some men but not others to paper. There's no magic formula, no easy equation. I know I've never wanted to lump men together as types like curds in a split sauce. I wanted to taste each one separately. I didn't intend to send to men in my memoir. It was meant to be a chapter about my childhood, followed by a chapter about me, followed by another chapter about how special I am, perhaps a micro chapter about my husband or my cat or the internet for balance. But men are hiding in every memory, every personal recollection. They dominate elsewhere too. In culture and finance, in economics and politics, they are the his in history. My hackles go up along with yours, but from where I stand I can see that masculinity is both freeing and limiting. The traditionally male qualities of strength, courage, leadership and independence are also constructed and fallible. Being a man is never net good or net bad. This book isn't so much for men as about them. I've been trying to nutshell what it is about them that has kept me intrigued my whole life. It boils down to 3 things. Firstly, I love them. Secondly, I can see how bottomlessly problematic they are. Thirdly, both these things converge on my own sense of self, my own masculinity. You have your own men, of course, in all their infuriating, labyrinthine complexity. In the following essays, you get to meet mine. I love men so much, but fuck me, they're annoying. I'm really careful to try and balance the pros and cons of masculinity, to be considered and unbiased, even-handed and level-headed, but sometimes men just get on my tits. I'm none of the insults that have been lobbied at feminists over the years. I'm not anti-men, I'm not a sexless finger-wagging shrew, I'm not a bitch or a prude. At the same time, I completely understand the appeal of those positions, of a manless celibacy. Shrews do not need taming. Ditching men is rather shrewd. As I traipse this planet, sometimes strutting like Carrie in her knickers before she falls on the runway, sometimes keeping my head down and my headphones in, administering euphoric pop songs as antidepressants, men still find a way to get on my nerves. Men are more annoying than fully English people saying pourquoi in a fully English conversation, or those grown adults who talk in a baby voice, or people with dreamer in their bio. I've had just about all I can manage of men and their bullshit. I collect male transgressions like tourist souvenirs, a snow globe for each irritation, a fridge magnet for every time they've wound me up. I could do you a Jack the Ripper tour of male misdemeanours. Sometimes a man will sit next to me on the tube with his knees so far apart it's like he has the Taj Mahal in his pants and his nuts are bowling balls. Sometimes groups of men Stonehenge public pavements, nursing beers and refusing to gently ease themselves out of my path. There was a guy recently at the swimming pool who, on seeing that I was drying myself with a pink towel, called me brave. During a scramble to deboard a plane, there was an untall guy stage whispering under his breath about my bag's hierarchy in the overhead system. It does always seem to be a man that's exerting a commentary on how my own masculinity sits in a space. Sometimes it's verbal, sometimes it's not. A man will flex his manliness invisibly or visibly, consciously or not, penetrating a situation with some male vigour. It is, frankly, exhausting. I like the club sandwich of human life, the men, the women, the in-betweeners, the undecided. Gender is both a contradictory and complementary blend of flavours. But the male ingredient is dominant like Stilton in a creme caramel, and I can never get the taste of it out of my mouth. There is no adequate palate cleanser. There's no escaping men's thick Philadelphia spread coating all of our tongues. A testosterone-spiked buffet. Men are ever present like Botox in a celebrity forehead. I'm not suggesting the sexes should be separated. I'm not advocating dick apartheid. But even the most female spaces, hen do's, baby showers, spa days, films with subtitles at the cinema, are male adjacent too, whether it's a question of stags, impregnators, or, well, the male skew of Hollywood. The thing I missed most when the world locked down was my walking commute to my office. When I'm walking to work, I have an insatiable appetite for looking at men's arses as they ride past. I can't not look at their buttocks encased in lycra or cotton or denim. I am the David Attenborough of pert and not so pert cheeks, collecting and assessing at an anthropological level. It's almost as if I'm double-checking that the men even have bums, like quickly patting my pocket for my passport on the way to the airport. What is it about the arses zipping about that intrigues me so? I just find it hot. That might be where Attenborough and I diverge routes, because he doesn't fancy the wildlife and spring watch ends when summer hits. Arsewatch is an incurable disease, a sort of heroin for my eyes. I try to abstain, but I don't think a man has ever cycled past me without my eyes darting to his backside. A litter of them, kettled at a red light, can wreak havoc on my concentration. On a clear day, when I see a particularly good one, think 2 boiled eggs in a handkerchief, I am like a magpie spotting a gold coin. I have to see the guy's face. I do not secretly want to devour the arsewatch bums, the way legs men say they like legs, but what they're really saying is they like where legs lead. The habit is almost carry on in its laughable sexiness, in its lack of menace. I don't feel bad about myself, but I don't feel great either. We all have sexual triggers, things we see or hear or taste that form a type of sensory acknowledgement, a prelude to a round of heightened sexual awareness, an early prologue for arousal, for foreplay. We don't seek out these triggers as much as notice them. I'm wondering how to frame this, if I just come off as a pervert. I realise I'm not helping with the stereotype that gay men are arse mad. I find it nearly impossible to detangle the strands of amorous spaghetti that keep me on high alert for the gluteus maximus of the male cyclist. This is a perversion nestled closely to my heart, like a Second World War Bible ready to take a bullet. I've never told anyone of this daily visual worship. Where in this admission of desire do I cross the creepy line? Does my predilection make me grim and shallow? I genuinely think of myself as an evolved human, not a horny Neanderthal. I like to party and I love men, but I'm not a sad tits pervert in a pub trying to buy the girls drinks and calling them lesbians if they decline. I'm a respectful member of society, clued up on consensual matters, who can't seem to stop himself glancing. As I thumb scroll my memories, I realise every moment intersects with masculinity in some way, either impacted by the actions of men or causing a recalibration of my own sense of maleness. Some memories are more piercing and invasive than others. After I lost my virginity, I had been penetrated by masculine energy, and though it had undoubtedly altered my own masculine energy, I was none the wiser. You immediately know where you stand with an erection, don't you? It's right there, pointing at you, making a sort of solid sense, a hard truth. As a newly card-carrying homosexual, I was besotted with men. Okay, I wasn't newly besotted with men themselves, but I'd had certain realizations about their capabilities and a newfound, more precise and localized interest in them. The way they moved, the way they acted, I was a sexual blank slate full of hope and desire and possibility. I have met so many men that left me on edge, some of whom had the audacity to leave me on red. There have been more bad dates than a rotten sticky toffee pudding. There were the type men who didn't buy me any drinks or slyly ordered themselves doubles when I was a singleton. I once went on a date with a chap and he turned around at the bar mid-date and made out with someone else. I fled out into the night trying to sober up and bumped into them half an hour later coming out of the club when I returned for my coat. I thought I'd hit the jackpot with a Scottish, short, good sense of humour guy who knew how to drop an acerbic meme in the chat, but he was yet another boyish time waster whose main personality trait, when finally revealed, was being tired. I understand that being tired is a thing, but an aura of stress and typing stabby emails on your phone and doing big dramatic yawns when it goes quiet in a room is somebody's type of person. It's just not mine. My sexual psyche couldn't resist men imported from Spain in my early 20s, which at best is a fetish, at worst, low-level racism. A Spanish guy I worked with toyed with my emotions, like my heart was one of many in the tapas of his potential conquests. I'm not certain it's okay to do a tapas metaphor, but here it is. Despite the Spaniard vaguely insinuating he wasn't interested, I felt like he was giving me the signals, little clues that he liked me back, like when people see Jesus on slices of toast. I was addicted to the unrequitedness. In fairness, he gave me some quite explicit signals he wasn't interested, and my own denial gaslit me. It culminated one night with me drunk in a bar while Doris Day's Perhaps played, singing, "If you can't make your mind up, go back to España, 'cause I don't want to wind up, hasta mañana." This was, I'm ready to admit, a low point. I wish I could adopt the MDMA advice a high woman gave me in the loos at a party. Always dab, never snort, she said, but I have been snorting men my whole life. Great piles of them, like Scarface. I dabbled, only to become a high-functioning addict, and I've never successfully detoxed. I've never been able to clear my system. I am hooked. There's only one niggling, outstanding problem I have with all of this. One thing stopping me binning men off completely. I am one. Raven Smith's Men was written and read by Raven Smith, abridged by Robin Brooks, produced by Naomi Walmsley.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Raven Smith. Welcome to this abridged version of Raven Smith's Men. I put pen to paper to trace the roots of my masculinity, trying to distill what it is about men that has kept me enthralled and irritated my entire life. I love men, but men are problematic. I also happen to be one. I recount as many of my men as possible, from school jocks, teenage kicks, right through the thicket of my 20s and out the other side. Obviously, my dad is in there, as is my long-suffering husband. Talking about men can get very serious very fast, but before we page Dr. Freud, it's worth mentioning I've had a lot of laughs and a handful of orgasms. Lucky me! Join me as I paint the portrait of my life lived in parallel with other men. I am as curious as I am terrified. Expect sex, expect drugs, expect strong language and bad decisions. Episode 2, New York. By my third year at university, I was living alone and going out every night. My life at the time was measured in parties. London was my mistress until I cheated on her, embarking on a 90-day affair with New York, the exact length of a tourist visa. I booked a flight to JFK 3 months after my degree, undercoating adulthood with one last hurrah. I say after my degree, but I'd actually failed to graduate because of some coursework I couldn't be asked to do. Anyway, it was about time to leave the country. I was struggling through the collateral damage of the funeral for a family friend, a girl my age with cystic fibrosis. She was always poorly in our childhoods, chuffing on an inhaler, but she got critically sick critically fast. My mate didn't make it. Her window was too small for an appropriate donor. I remember sobbing into my stepdad's armpit to Reach for the Stars by S Club 7 at the funeral, probably hungover. I got the train back to London and went straight out that night. I had this ebbing sense my life was going the wrong way, my development not so much arrested as in full retrograde, like reading a self-help book backwards. People were getting entry-level jobs and I was back in the cave trying to make a fire with 2 sticks. But I escaped my regression, or at least put it on hold, and away I flew. A week before my flight, I'd randomly met a Manhattan-dwelling Brit at a lock-in who said I could sleep on his sofa when I arrived, as long as I didn't tell immigration his name. I slept in a single bed under a mezzanine in a Tribeca loft for a month. I was a deliberate non-tourist. I've still never been to Katz's Deli, famous for serving fake orgasms. Instead, I walked down Fifth Avenue, listening to Englishman in New York on status symbol iPod headphones, white, long-wired. I ordered bottomless coffee in diners. I drank PBRs at lesbian karaoke nights where some terribly sad-looking girl would always sing Lisa Loeb's Stay with the Passion of the Christ. My clothes were interesting. I dressed like the Artful Dodger had moved to New York, an unappetizing garment salad. I wore the most aggressively look at me living my best life on a tiny budget clothing. Converse were obligatory. Further up, my look was the tightest Topshop skinny jeans and dead men's shirts in garish patterns that I took in so they were skin tight. I wore a bowler hat. I found a gold raincoat and took it in on a sewing machine which compromised its waterproof ability. Jewellery-wise, I had a penchant for bric-a-brac albatrossed at the neck, lassoed on a chain with a spiral keyring. Anything metallic and not too weighty was slung against my chest. I vividly remember my signature peanut-cum-tiny knife hitting my ribcage as I bopped to Hounds of Love, not the Kate Bush version. Realising the street value of my Britishness, I immediately became more pronounced in my English. I sometimes said governor, I sometimes said spiv. As I happily supplanted the East London hipsters for Brooklyn ones, I'd log into MySpace in the morning from my laptop and see if my outfits had worked and if someone had taken any pictures of me at the party. The dream was a cobra snake shot, packed in the basement of Misshapes. My MySpace name was Raven Does Boys, but I was perennially single. I don't recall doing any boys, or vice versa. New York is fabled for its extreme seasons, but I don't remember any weather. I remember an assembly of the kind of hangovers where you look down at lunchtime and realise you're dressed as a fluorescent jester or one of those Covent Garden street performers. I lived off Starbucks frappes and single servings of Tropicana, the one with the pulp left in for the sake of my health. After a month in New York, I moved to McKibben Lofts, a huge abandoned factory in the medium bad part of Brooklyn. The building had a freight lift that we only used when visitors came to exemplify our New Yorkness, and it was a far cry from the Rosemary's Baby type Upper East Side apartment I still dream of. The area is beyond gentrified now. You can't move for microbreweries, but at the time we'd hear gunshots and just shrug until a local resident said, if you hear gunshots, you eat the fucking pavement. McKibben smelled like teen spirit, but everyone was at least 25, with the faraway, never-grow-up stare of Never Never Land Lost Boys. It was a tessellation of dorms, each containing up to 6 eccentric roommates that rarely had anything in common. My roomies were like a gnarled videotape of Friends where all the cast are distorted. Hester, a space cadet in the truest sense of the word, actually dressed as a space cadet, painted bright blue, for an alternative beauty pageant. My other flatmate had a dog called Vlad, who remains the ugliest animal I've ever encountered, a sweet potato with 4 legs and bad breath. My upstairs neighbour Farge remains a good friend. He went on to be McKibben's longest-serving party boy, a veteran of the scene, advising over-partied youngsters like the games master. The factory was a conveyor belt of merrymakings. You could always hear the beat of a good time calling out to you. I grew accustomed to life on the L train, visiting Manhattan for parties. And then I met a boy. He was a musician, a performer, a white rapper, an openly gay Eminem. His band were pretty good. The musician was a new rave darling who wore patterned leggings unironically. I'd go to his gigs. He really, and I don't say this lightly, liked to party. He never spent an evening at home, ever. His entire schedule was slotting work around parties. He partied harder than me, who was partying harder than Britney. But I was going hard and then I was going home. I was on a very long holiday, but a holiday it was. I had adulthood waiting for me back in London. For the musician, the party was eternal. I was homesick in a way that I could feel in my bones. I was all at sea and I was drinking through it. I've known a lot of men. I've slept with a handful. And nothing feels as acute and as chaotic as a romance when you're far away from home, miles away from familiarity. I always thought I was terrible at love when I was younger, that I sacrificed the wrong things and I stayed in bad relationships. But this one was a charade, a shimmer of the love I needed. I had a great big space ready to fill with another person, but mine and the musician's parts didn't quite fit. I had a longing for someone to caulk my cracks. It wasn't him. He wasn't the filler, but he was right there, and I could hold off on feeling sad a little longer. It's a rite of post-adolescent passage, I think, to neatly parcel up your heart and give it to someone with butterfingers. I think the musician was simply too high to adequately hold on to it. I'm relieved, in retrospect, that it didn't tip into anything serious. I don't remember how the musician and I ended up at yet another after-party in a loft on Christmas Eve. My mum had arrived in late December in her huge red fake fur monsoon coat, one that me and my mate had climbed into when we were stone teens and accidentally torn the lining out of. She'd been with me for 3 nights, staying in Times Square, which in retrospect seems quite flashy, and I took the opportunity to finally tourist New York, Rockefeller Tree, Empire State Building, that big piano, still no Katz's Deli. I'd packed her onto a plane home and naturally gone straight out. All I remember about the after party with the musician is that the space was so huge that they had propped up a small boat that they were using as shelving, and the music was shit. Nobody was guarding the bottle of Patron on the giant kitchen island, more of a kitchen continent, so we took it. Straight into one of our thrifted coats it went, and we left. We were halfway across the Brooklyn Bridge and several gulps down when I realised it was a bottle of lukewarm house party piss. "It's piss," I said. "It's not piss," he said. This went back and forth with tentative retastes like grim sex party sommeliers. We made it perhaps another inch down the bottle before I noticed his giant pupils. "You're on drugs," I said. "You're on fucking drugs. Where did you get drugs, you fucking drug addict? I can't believe you're on drugs." I don't know if you know the mechanics of Ritalin. It's an ADHD medication that makes you concentrate really hard. A Canadian friend of mine, versed in the medicinal advantages of study drugs, had said it's fine to do if you're studying because you lock onto the paper that's due and don't look away. What you have to be careful of, she said, is what you lock onto, lest you spend the evening fixatedly stroking a cheese plant. I can appreciate, in retrospect, that if you're with someone on Ritalin and you say, you're a drug addict as you speed across the East River in the dead of night, all piss drinking aside, they might be chemically susceptible to lock onto that, to become fixated on their own drug taking, to question whether it's possibly tipping into addiction. We got home and I thought nothing more of it. I was annoyed I wasn't on drugs. I was annoyed that I'd accidentally drunk piss. His pupils were black side plates at Nobu. I went to bed. He woke me early, gently stroking my head to explain that I was right, that he was a drug addict. Rather than sleep, he'd spent the whole night ringing everybody in his phone book to let them know that he was a drug addict. His bandmates, his friends, he'd called his mum and his stepdad, he'd called his father. This was, of course, without a shadow of a doubt, a bad thing. He was leaving for home that afternoon anyway because it was Christmas fucking Eve. All I could think was this is the single most worst thing that could have happened while I slept. What I actually said was, try not to worry about it. I think it will all be fine. And then I left. I saw the musician again one last time, and I don't remember once talking about the drug addict dial-a-thon. It was just too huge to chat through, and I was leaving imminently. Should I have done more? He never asked explicitly for help. I want to say something serious, like I wasn't able to absorb the musician's heaviness alongside my own because I was too sad myself. But actually, I was just 21, on holiday, and a bit of an idiot, keen to bypass anything too serious. New Year's Eve was the big send-off. Faj had a party at his place and I stayed up for hours. At some point, I toasted myself with a vitamin water and hailed a cab to JFK. Having taken rather a large bite out of the Big Apple, possibly more than I could chew, I smuggled my New Year's hangover back across the Atlantic. Back to the shit-caked glamour of London. Back to the spacious accommodation for people who hate their money. Back to my paused adulthood. I'd had a lot of fun, but I never did make it to Cobra Snake. Raven Smith's Men was written and read by Raven Smith, abridged by Robin Brooks, produced by Naomi Walmsley.
I'm Elizabeth Day.
I'm Johnny Pitts.
And we present Radio 4's Open Book, Join us on BBC Sounds if you love to read and want to discover what brilliant books to pick up next.
From Booker Prize winners to the hottest debuts, listen to our conversations with the most exciting authors telling us about their creative inspirations. We're here to help you grow your bookshelves, expand your horizons,
and escape into a great book. Open Book with Elizabeth Day and Johnny Pitts on BBC Sounds.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Raven Smith. Welcome to this abridged version of Raven Smith's Men. I put pen to paper to trace the roots of my masculinity, trying to distill what it is about men that has kept me enthralled and irritated my entire life. I love men, but men are problematic. I also happen to be one. I recount as many of my men as possible, from school jocks, teenage kicks, right through the thicket of my 20s and out the other side. Obviously, my dad is in there, as is my long-suffering husband. Talking about men can get very serious very fast, but before we page Dr. Freud, it's worth mentioning I've had a lot of laughs and a handful of orgasms. Lucky me! Join me as I paint the portrait of my life lived in parallel with other men. I am as curious as I am terrified. Expect sex, expect drugs, expect strong language and bad decisions. Episode 3, The Graduate. I once got hit in the face with an orange, assaulted with a citrus fruit, if you will. It wasn't on purpose, but it still hurt. It was at a birthday drinks around the time of the London Olympics in a bar on Ridley Road Market in East London. The bar may well still be there, and it probably has a circular blue plaque that says Ravensmith got tangoed here. It was a grubby little place with toilets that still feel like outhouses, remnants from Victorian London, with chipped tiles and non-existent heat so you can see the steam rise off your piss. The bar's decor was sourced entirely from the market itself, which is a nice idea because the gentrifying masses love a touch of community with their hedonism, but you also end up with 2 plastic colanders masquerading as a lampshade. You could see the bare bulb through the holes, and traces of light danced on your eyeballs long after you looked away. It compounded any drunkenness and wasn't altogether pleasant. I'd love to ground this time period in critical world events, but my addiction to the internet's deathless scroll was burgeoning, and I only remember a few things. The lady who put the cat in the bin. The Spanish woman who grievously retouched a Jesus fresco, smudging it out of recognition. The British woman who hit her head and got a Chinese accent. Frank Ocean coming out on Tumblr. Samantha Brick saying she was insatiably hot happened somewhere in the mix here too, as was 2 Girls, 1 Cup. But I'm patchy on dates. On reflection, this may have been the greatest epoch in the history of the trivial internet, where brilliant stories lasted days rather than minutes, and there were no memes. It was someone's birthday because it's always someone's birthday, and we, in our roaring 20s, needed cover stories to heavily drink. All of us getting out of our skulls on cheap drinks, trying to delete the noise of our entry-level jobs, alcohol waterproofing us against reality. When you're a student, especially in London, every night is one for cheap drinks. The big mad for it Fridays and Saturdays are irrelevant because you're out whenever you want. There's no weekend, just a slurred series of evenings. Anything is possible. Go to GAY late on a weeknight with its drinks deals and mainstream faggotry. Get ejected from GAY late later that same weeknight and mot out a falafel pitta on the night bus. Get up tomorrow and do it again. When you hit early adulthood as graduates and enter workplaces with rigorous timeframes, Fridays become the finale of the juggernaut that is the capitalist working week. Work itself is a culture shock from the general malaise of studenthood. You suddenly have mornings with a routine that gets you out of the house and onto the tube and into an office. You spend your earliest career days trying not to get caught Googling how to do the tasks you said you were proficient at on your CV, but you do acclimatise. Each person I've met on this planet carries a delicious individualism, but they can also be categorised into certain types, sorted into larger houses. At work, these types get shoved together in a great vocational jambalaya. There's brown nosers, hard-boiled brown nosers with Machiavellian tendencies, scurrying around after the big boss. There's always someone with head girl energy, but they needn't be a girl, nor particularly advanced up the chain. There's always someone who's desperately trying to get outside of work events happening, pleading for a night at the pub or, God forbid, bowling. There's someone who willingly lets their hangover pollute the whole space. There's someone who's perennially late like it's a personality trait. It's not. Someone who calls in sick at the slightest sniffle. I had a colleague who didn't come in one day because her cat got in a fight with another cat, but I think this was more indicative of some trickle-down bullying. Someone, like me, who chats in a distracting way, but still gets all their work done. And you have a collective history in a workspace, silly spats that congeal in the room like Boxing Day bread sauce, forming into a crust of ancient grudge. People conspire against each other, chasing credit and affirmation from the boss. There's always someone to curb your procrastination or ask why you're in a mood. Nothing puts me in a mood like being asked why I'm in a mood. Offices have a needy co-worker codependence, coupled with constant one-upmanship, everyone with an eye on the promotion. There's lots of people who work hard but don't make a big thing of it. There's people who work hard and like to point it out at every opportunity. There's people who don't really work hard but seem to get constantly rewarded. All of this feeds into the congealing bread sauce of spats, the Montague versus Capulet grudges. Your Neanderthal fight-or-flight reflexes, evolved to armour you from a saber-toothed tiger or cranky woolly mammoth, are channeled into spreadsheets and Word docs that imply your ownership of tasks that safeguard your own ideas. But you can hate the hierarchy of a place and still scale it. Nearly every job I've had has come with reams of male privilege. I found myself carving out a niche as a naughty but promising boy in an office of women. Naughtiness is more tolerated in men, to be honest. I was still listened to in meetings. I did once get accused of mansplaining, but most of the time, men are listened to regardless of skill or accuracy. I have a filthy habit of turning the air loud, and I'm brash and unapologetically confident, and I wonder how many of the women I worked with were allowed those qualities in the same quantities. Some of my female colleagues would sort of unsay things they had said, a quiet or not at the end of anything that could be deemed too direct. A lightly passive disclaimer after an assertive act. My job at the time was entry-level, despite already being 5 years out of university. Post-higher education, I'd had my first lucky break, transitioning from intern with an asymmetric haircut, even I'm not sure how I managed that, to art books editor. The schedule was demanding. I oversaw 7 titles in the year I was there, and as a youngster entering the industry, I didn't realise the power of taking any type of break. I was anti-downtime. I just grafted harder and harder like Boxer in Animal Farm, not getting more efficient or strengthening my concentration because I was fighting a bone tiredness that never lifted. My boss was a nightmare, frankly, the kind of man who presented as quite bohemian and architectural, but had a nasty habit of barking at people, of deliberately making them feel small. People were genuinely terrified of him, and I remember lots of tears in meetings and genuinely stunned silences. A freelance designer once lost the physical draft of a book and was publicly flogged. Well, flogged with words. It sounds like a toxic workplace because it was. As a survivor, a cockroach of the workplace, I very quickly mastered the key skill to any working life: disarmament. I repeatedly and systematically disarmed my boss. I've never had to nullify a rising anger quite like I did in that job. I'm not completely sure how I did it. While others wiggled and winced from his verbal assault, I somehow slid forward unharmed. I never once got in trouble, until the day he finally exploded and demoted everyone on the staff, and I slipped my resignation under his hand before he had a chance to bin me off. So yeah, if you're one of the graduates lucky enough to be dropped into adult employment, Fridays are your respite, an escape from the chess game of office politics. Fridays are the blurred line between the working week and wanton playtime. It can be difficult to change your mindset from work to fun, but the best catalyst is booze. The thing is that even as a rampant drinker, I'm not really one for pubs. I'm a stand-up drunk. I like to shimmy. It's the queuing in pubs that really gets on my tits and under my skin. Just as you start to relax, it's time for your round, and you have to get back up and order. I love a bar though, preferably with stools screwed to the floor and little hooks by your knees, where people lean over you to order, their armpit your temporary accommodation. In a way, sitting at the bar is stationary queuing, the type I can manage. Sitting at a bar, you are the queue. You never have to join it from the rear. Back to the orange assault on that literally fruitful night at the bar on the market with the colander lampshades. We gathered like bobbing Halloween apples, glasses of beer or gin and tonic thrown down the neck. The look of the time was horse girl, a Breton and a barber, a messy pony, your hair, not your livestock, an off-duty model in the countryside energy, a sniff of metropolitan life but ever ready to muck in or muck out. I wasn't above the horseplay. I had a waxen jacket and innumerable stripy tops, but I have never worn Wellingtons in the city. That has always struck me as a step too far, even on the rainiest of commutes. I look back at the pictures from the time, but they were all taken on BlackBerry, the forgiving pixelation obscuring the closer details of the deranged fits. I'm sorry I can't be more gentle with this, but I look cheap. I was kind of raggedy in appearance. Nothing looked finished or fitted, let alone pricey. Entry-level jobs lack the paycheck that gets you to glossy and glamorous and expensive. I went outside for a cigarette because I was still a smoker, because at that point smoking had yet to tip from carelessly unhealthy to fucking disgusting. A very drunk friend of a friend was in the smoking pen, a square of market drawn in spray paint outside the bar, yammering on about something inane. He seemed on the verge of blackout, or perhaps had already entered that fateful stage of drunkenness and was zombieing blithely forward. As I turned to re-enter the market bar, he picked up an orange and threw it, sort of at nobody, sort of at the bar. The citrus orb hit me square in the face, nose first, then cheeks. Drunk people do the strangest things, their bravado peaking, their inhibitions mush. I can't be bothered to assign some meaning to the orange lob, but based on the action alone, may I just say, for the record, that the guy was a clown shoe. The pain was instant and opaque. A lava of boiling Tropicana poured directly onto my face. I guess people who get punched all the time are used to this sensation of thuddery, but as a sporadic punchy, I was stunned, grappling for meaning. I thought my eyes would pop from their sockets and dribble to my chin on veiny stalks. I felt my face for blood, but my fingers came back clean. My eyeballs hadn't moved. A reactive, heavy mouth breathing ensued. My nose was pins, my lips needles. The guy was gone. I don't know if you've ever had someone throw something into your face as hard as they can. It doesn't matter what kind of working week you've had, how much gin you consumed. An orange to the face is immediately sobering. As the buoyant ABV blood in my veins turned to lead, I walked back into the bar for another drink, a restorative toddy to de-orange my nerves. Nothing gets between me and the Friday night crossover. The weekend was just beginning, and it was my round. Raven Smith's Men was written and read by Raven Smith. abridged by Robin Brooks, produced by Naomi Walmsley.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Raven Smith. Welcome to this abridged version of Raven Smith's Men. I put pen to paper to trace the roots of my masculinity, trying to distill what it is about men that has kept me enthralled and irritated my entire life. I love men, but men are problematic. I also happen to be one. I recount as many of my men as possible, from school jocks, teenage kicks, right through the thicket of my 20s and out the other side. Obviously, my dad is in there, as is my long-suffering husband. Talking about men can get very serious very fast, but before we page Dr. Freud, it's worth mentioning I've had a lot of laughs and a handful of orgasms. Lucky me! Join me as I paint the portrait of my life lived in parallel with other men. I am as curious as I am terrified. Expect sex, expect drugs, expect strong language and bad decisions. Episode 4, My Dad, My Simon. As a man who loves men, my relationship with my dad is unsurprisingly complex. I have reached a stage where we're in irregular contact, but he's not present in my daily life, nor considered in any of my big decisions. He's not who I credit for where I've gotten so far. My mum, who I lived with, was the rolling storyline like a soap opera. My visits to my dad are remembered in more distinct chapters. As a child of a breakup, you do compare parents, but my mum wins, hands down. It's just that my dad, as a sideline player, could do star turns every other weekend. Rather than keep me fed and sheltered, no small task, he could make a fuss and buy my attention and affection. It was relatively inexpensive. I'm talking about the only childhood currency that matters, sweets. Before I was born, my dad got stabbed at the ice rink, and I've never shaken the imaginary image of his blood pooling out onto the frozen ice. It must have been hugely traumatic, and I can see the ripples of that event in his life now, still pooling, still spreading. He pretty much never leaves Brixton. It's a safe space for him. On one occasion, he told me to never walk the same route home on consecutive days because then people could easily plan when to jump you. Not fully paranoid, this sense of attack, because he was actually stabbed, but it does feel a bit cannabis psychosis too. My dad bought me desert boots when I was 9, and as we took them for a walk through the local patch of dry grass Lambeth Council were calling a park, he asked me, "What would you do if someone tried to fight you right now?" I said, "Tell them to go away," which he insisted might not work. He's very secretive, or maybe just never saw me as need to know. I thought me and my half-sister were the only offspring. We went to the corner shop, and he introduced me as his son, and when the guy behind the counter asked how many kids he had, he said 4. 4, I said as we left the shop. He said another woman had once claimed that he was the father of her kid, a boy, but they lived far away. Sure, Dad, but wow, but okay, but fine. Then we went back to his flat and he showed me a black and white photograph of 2 twin girls he'd fathered. It looked like 50s old. And all I could say was, "Dad, if that woman had a baby, and then there's these twins, and then there's me and my half-sister, that's 5 kids." And he just giggled. He took up martial arts and steroids. I remember him really bulking up, which I'm sure isn't unconnected to being physically attacked, and becoming, if not physically unapproachable, then at least the kind of guy you'd think twice about attacking. And he was huge, massive. I have loads of pictures of him competing, a numbered rosette clipped to his G-string, often in the pose you do right after you hit a golf ball. but his arms and legs are huge Coca-Cola Christmas hams. And with the training and diet and body control and steroids and competition came the violence towards my mum. Nothing I ever saw or remember, but categorically the reason we left London. And muscle to me has always felt slightly sinister, slightly menacing, slightly, potentially violent. When teenagerdom hit, my dad bought me my first pager, which is unarguably cool. Nothing I've bought before or since can come close to this translucent plastic symbol of status. I received maybe 10 pages in the 2 years I had it, but that is besides the point. And visiting him from Brighton felt cool. When I eventually moved back to London and, like any aspiring cool person, got heavily into vinyl, my dad gave me the pick of his records. My dad gave me loads of Motown and Stevie Wonder. My mum's original Bowie records were shuffled into the stack, which seems incredibly eerie, a sudden vision of my parents, still in love, listening to Marvin Gaye and getting it on. Yuck! I would claim them for her just the same. I don't remember him having anything kid-friendly in his flat. I never drew dresses or pets because there was no colouring in paraphernalia, no Lego, no holy dressing up box, just an adult life with adult stuff and a visiting kid who assimilated to that. I'm no psychologist, but most kids of divorce, my parents never actually married, have dual identities. Most mixed-raced kids do it too, and homosexuals, and anyone questioning the fabric of their gender, and women, and men. I'm not alone in the personality split of dialing up or down my character thermostat depending on the climate. It's just glaring how extreme it was with my father. Perhaps it's a natural thing that I got less blinkered to my preset hero and less adoring as I got older. Maybe I instinctively knew I wasn't going to get the return I needed. It was easy to just gradually give him less of my real self and more of the version that appealed to him, which is either a cop-out or a survival instinct, or both. It pains me to admit that this summation, this ongoing question, is precisely the kind of conversation I usually have with a near stranger at the end of a boozy dinner. My dad never loved me in the way I needed to be loved, I'll say to the half-friend before the concerned host discreetly calls me an Uber. Obviously, I have unfinished business with my dad, but isn't unfinished business the heart of any family? Issues that felt so pressing at the time that you've let go in order to function happily for the sake of familial equilibrium. I am a man of action, but there's nothing for me to do here. There's no remedy for this silent father-son discrepancy. It's a frayed relationship, sure, but nicely cauterized family members are incredibly hard to come by. There's always unfinished business with a parent, or at least an ongoing amorphous relationship, a series of trials and errors and promises to yourself to be different next time. I know what you're thinking. Oh, great, another gay boy with unresolved daddy issues, but it does feel resolved to a point. It's not been difficult because my father's presence has always been distant, in the rear-view mirror of my life, and it's only in the sitting and writing of this that it feels desperately close, larger than it appears. I have a dad, a biological dad I guess we'll call him, but I have two other parents, my mum and my Simon, one blood, one bloodless. My mum met my stepdad in a club. He danced over and honestly we've never seen him dance again. I was 14 when he foxtrotted into our lives. In the grand tradition of humans, of course I wanted to be loved in some way, I wanted approval, but from a 43-year-old stranger, no thank you. I was inwardly gay, and a new man in the house leaving trails of his pheromones in the morning hallway was an assault to my shifting sense of self. My mum welcomed the excitement of a stranger, the same way I felt when I met my husband, but to me, her Simon was an unwelcome guest. Me and my mum, at this stage, were incredibly close, too close maybe, barnacles. All the clichés were with us, single-parent mother and only child, gay man and his mum, mixed-race kid and, well, the rampant racism of the outside world. It had always been the two of us, and we had a sort of psychic shorthand, a silent emotional patter. I was anxious about going to university, 4 years in the future at this point, about emptying the nest, about leaving my mother on her own. There was, naturally, a space in my mum's life for a romantic union, an emptiness I couldn't fill, one that I hadn't even noticed until my Simon stepped up. My mum had been coping as a single parent forever. When my Simon arrived, romantic love cracked my mum like an egg. Her I'm coping personality stuttered. This warrior who raised me had gone soft. In retrospect, this wasn't bad. Years of fight or flight energy cannot be good for you, but in the moment, I felt my world tilting. I would love to convert this into a narrative of an evil stepfather, me the gay Cinderella, covered in soot and wishing myself to balls. But my Simon, the civil engineer, wasn't the big bad wolf. The transition from stranger danger to third non-biological parent wasn't swift. I remember him being very fair and measured and not very vulnerable. He was always generous, and his wells of kindness revealed themselves over time. He bought me incredibly practical, no-nonsense, boring gifts. A sleeping bag for my sweet 16th, yawn, that literally kept me warm for a decade of festivals and house parties. There was no reckoning, no flip. He ebbed in. I remember the tonal shift when I realised that if something bad happened to my mum, if she died, he'd still be my parent. When I gave up smoking, he rang me to check I was still off the fags. I am, I said, and Mum says she'll still love me if I slip and I start smoking again. And so will I, was his response. This is the first time he told me he loved me. He is the most level-headed person I know. I've never seen him angry. I've never seen him drunk. When we're all together, me and my mum and my Simon, there is a hierarchy of bosses, like in a video game. It's a pyramid of common sense that's never been learned. It's just universally understood. Simon knows best. The best way to cheesecake, the best way to egg scramble, the best way to not use metal on the non-stick pans. I regret this deeply. My Simon is a man with an insatiable forwardness, a momentum. It's been instilled in me from my mid-teens, a constant what-nextness. When we first met, he called me an ostrich, a boy who'd put his head in the sand when times were tough rather than face the music, a boy who'd put everything off until tomorrow. It's a metaphor that's stuck harder than gunned glue, harder than industrial nails. I have been de-ostriching ever since. I always think, what next as I push forward? He's with me in the nextness. Dreams are fine. Dreams are important, but you also need the tools to make them happen. Dreams are dead in your hand without drive. My Simon gave me lifelong drive. I know the world is full of non-bloodline love, but honestly, who would want to be a step-parent? It is the least rewarding gig on the planet. Step-kids don't automatically welcome you in. It can't be fun. There's lots of great step-parents full of love to give and brilliant, rewarding, fortifying step-families, but nobody would consciously choose stepping, I'm certain. My Simon and I were thrown together by a wonderful common denominator. Have I mentioned my mum? And here we are, thriving in our bloodless family, our separate DNA. Between them, my mum and my Simon did a decent enough job preparing me for the world. I still call them all the time for help, and I dread the day that they're not at the other end of the phone. The umbilical cord got longer and longer, and despite our apprehensions, we are all fine. I made it out of the ostrich sand. There was no empty nest. And I don't worry about my mum anymore, because she married a good one. Raven Smith's Men was written and read by Raven Smith, abridged by Robin Brooks, produced by Naomi Walmsley.
I'm Elizabeth Day.
I'm Johnny Pitts.
And we present Radio 4's Open Book. Join us on BBC Sounds if you love to read and want to discover what brilliant books to pick up next.
From Booker Prize winners to the hottest debuts, listen to our conversations with the most exciting authors telling us about their creative inspirations. We're here to help you grow your bookshelves, expand your horizons,
And escape into a great book. Open Book with Elizabeth Day and Johnny Pitts on BBC Sounds.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Raven Smith. Welcome to this abridged version of Raven Smith's Men. I put pen to paper to trace the roots of my masculinity, trying to distill what it is about men that has kept me enthralled and irritated my entire life. I love men, but men are problematic. I also happen to be one. I recount as many of my men as possible, from school jocks, teenage kicks, right through the thicket of my 20s and out the other side. Obviously, my dad is in there, as is my long-suffering husband. Talking about men can get very serious very fast, but before we page Dr. Freud, it's worth mentioning I've had a lot of laughs and a handful of orgasms. Lucky me! Join me as I paint the portrait of my life lived in parallel with other men. I am as curious as I am terrified. Expect sex, expect drugs, expect strong language and bad decisions. Episode 5, The Kens. I know so many all-right-looking gay men who seem sad under the muscle, and it gets me down. They're all so tired of fighting their genetics, shell-shocked from going to war with their bodies. Veterans of the weights with a faraway look in their eyes, like they've seen too many squats. After all the gym straining, their veins pop and their physiques make a sad kind of sense. They're wider, they're leaner, above all they're peckier. Pecs are currency, traded for attention. They give the impression of a naturally occurring man in nature who lifts things in order to live physicality. He fells trees, he jacks lumber, he can start a fire with nothing but a spool of cotton and a penknife. My husband and I have some acquaintances we call the Kens. The Kens are traditionally, undebatably, homosexually hot. Big arms and big legs, and they wear Speedos at the beach like it's no big thing. We met them recently in Greece, swimming off our private dock and trespassing into a luxury villa across the bay. As we climbed the cliff steps, I had the chance to take in their Schwarzenegger bodies silhouetted against the sun. I posted a picture of them from a less porno angle, and my DMs lit up like Guy Fawkes night. Muscle is catnip for gays. They were hot. They are hot. They are the Kens. Everyone woofing in my DMs agreed. In real life, their bodies are overwhelming. The Kens have notable pecs. Between the two of them, there's 4 mounds of taut flesh, of man udder salting in the sun. They are incredibly thoughtful, interesting, creative men, but their bodies feel almost constantly aroused, pulsing with red-hot blood. That's obviously not to say that you can't be intellectual and hot, but they're gentle men, quite tender and not at all shouty, while their bodies are screaming sex, bellowing arousal. I know that to critique other people's bodies is not a great look, that one always sounds a little jealous commenting on the construction of someone else's hotness, but I'm not jealous, I'm captivated. I was somehow, somewhere built to fancy men. I fancy men, or the things that I understand to make men men. That's my thing. These men, the Kens, are men at their most manly, most physically unfeminine, if we're looking at the binary base code of gender. And as a gay sponge, it's impossible not to soak it in. They don't seem sad and overcooked. They are relaxed but rigid. Their bodies are a clear sign of the work they've done. Pecs take time, and with all the things I like to do, writing about pecs, for example, time is a sparse commodity. I envisage my own journey to pecs, stages up the pec pyramid. I assume there'd be a dietary requirement for maximum peckage, all chicken and spinach, 6 dozen eggs, so I'm roughly the size of a barge. But I have a long-standing weakness for at-home high teas. Wedges of rainbow-coloured birthday cake with crunchy fondant and smooth buttercream arriving via Deliveroo. Chicken breast in the pursuit of man breast? No, thank you. The growing pains of my youth didn't yield pectoral muscles. God stretched me to 6'4", and all I've got to show for it is zebraed marks on my hips and lower back. I remember asking my dad for a string vest when I was 18 and him saying, "You actually need a little muscle for a string vest, Raven." I was not a muscle teen. I think of hot men the world over, the Pitts and the DiCaprios, the Hollywood Chris's and the Clooneys. The thirsty DMs I get about how hot my husband is would make you blush. And yes, obviously he's attractive, but we're all biased towards vaguely muscular white men, towards a reflective blondness, towards the telltale signs of looking after yourself. And however regrettably I feel about it, I think about white men a lot. The way we, and I mean society at large, see them as hot by default, as the blueprint of hotness we're all riffing off. The way we think of fancying white men slightly outside the brackets of tall and young as a naughty indulgence. Pitt is 52, for example. Rishi Sunak is non-white. Naughty, naughty. Tucci has no hair. Get your freak on, girl. But they all firmly live in the still wood camp. As a group, they have a monopoly on society, and we all in some way protect that. We all find ourselves caught up in the general outrage that happens specifically when white men are threatened or wronged. This is a biased system. I bemoan its flaws, and yet all my boyfriends have been white men, not begrudgingly. I find it so deeply irritating that my own system of desire hasn't moved beyond the pale. I fancy Michelangelo's David too. It's his solid torso, the marbled veins of his arms, the perfect chicken fillets. He certainly doesn't seem sad under the muscle like the other hots. Is it wrong to want to get felt up by a sculpture but not the Kens? Save me from myself. Even though it often makes my eyes roll so hard they dislocate, I listen properly when my straight girlfriends report back from the front lines of their marriages. Part of me is enthralled by the way straight men perform domestic, non-platonic, private straightness. My early dalliances with straightness were flatly unsuccessful. Age 7, I once spied some loose jelly tots on the floor, chewed them up a bit, and threw them into a girl's hair. Her mum had to cut the jellied clump out with scissors. Destruction, if only of hair, is a form of creation, but there was no second date. I once had a Valentine's date with a girl and ended up putting my fist through a window, which sounds vaguely masked, so I won't add details to break the illusion. I realised pretty quickly that ending up with a woman was as far-fetched as the conclusions in the R.L. Steins I was binge reading. To this day, I have never quite got my head around it. Honestly, I'm cool as long as you don't rub my nose in it, but I struggle to feel like I'm missing out. Straight dating seems to involve infinite, exhausting calibrations of gender that lead you into the bedroom. It's a courtship dance, a copping off tango, a trek to naked joy. And before the settle, before the death of romantic hope, before the cologne cloud dry humping, is the dancing. There's something revealing about your moves, very, very adjacent to sex, a fully clothed but extremely public display of the motion in the ocean. Part of me is enthralled by the way straight men dance because, even after all the column inches devoted to David Beckham's sarong, so many still can't handle a shimmy across the floor. Men dancing can be a deliciously horrible watch, like each single foot is shaking the crumbs off different picnic blankets in separate parks in non-adjacent towns on different time zones. At weddings, where not dancing is a sacrilege akin to slapping a newborn, men either adopt the gait of a dozen battling ferrets sewn together in a skin suit, or they choose a regimented monosyllabic move. It's all a little too revealing, sexually speaking. It's like they're wanking on the dance floor. I, too, am a floor wanker, but quite a jolly one. I've never stubbed a toe or torn a ham. The closest I've come to an injury was when my left clog flew across the marquee at a wedding because I momentarily unclenched my foot during the Macarena. What I lack in technical skill, I make up for with unadulterated enthusiasm. I'm proud that I can have fun in the end of a boot, but a good party helps lube my joints. There's no point having killer moves if you've got nowhere to show them off. If there's no light-up dance floor, sob, I prefer a club scalloped by booths with little table lamps that don't have wires, or a dingy basement that smells of metal and sick, or a ballroom with a well-waxed parquet. People get quite tribal about music. It's something to do with teenage youth culture and scoring cool points. You can't get your freak on to fake plastic trees, I've tried, but people get incredibly pissy if you request Wham or anything else patently moonwalkable. There's also this collective mock pissiness of Come On Eileen, where people audibly groan, feigning displeasure, then stamp dance their goddamn tits off to the chorus. I can dance to anything with a beat, played on grand piano or Bluetooth kitchen speaker or a phone in a pint glass. My friend once hired a mariachi trio to play Work by Rihanna at her birthday dinner, and shimmying in my seat is the closest I've come to God over a sit-down meal. On the dance floor at a dream party, I'm nothing like those appealing Instagram influencers that dress like a skid mark of pastel. I'm ideally wearing Danny Zuko's shirt from the hand jive dance, or maybe I'm dressed head to toe in leather, like a strip of beef jerky with that iridescent meat rainbow when the light hits it right. I've always had this dream of river dancing into the Met Gala, so in a way every party is a dress rehearsal for that final destination. It's no secret that my party trick is stamina. Stamina is very much my thing. As a fellow guest, you may tire. You may sneak out to the smoker's patio. You may wander to the buffet for a few spoonfuls of coleslaw. You may even get fingered in the disabled loo. But you'll return to find me leapfrogging the bride, my battery still at 100%. For some magical reason, despite booze and clogs and overly ambitious footwork, I am steady on my feet. I bend, but I never snap. Because of weekly yoga, I can touch my toes easily, and if my trousers have enough give, you'd be surprised how often I can work it into a routine. Not all trousers have enough give, though. The crotch of my favourite party slacks has been rebuilt more times than Glasgow School of Art. Floor wanking is less about how you have sex stylistically and more about your eagerness to participate. I don't fuck like I dance or dance like I fuck, but I'm keen on both. Because the night belongs to lovers, we assume it takes two to tango, but I wine-dine 69 myself, shapes erotically thrown like the clay-potting ghost. I chew up the floor like loose jelly tots. I am a boogie vessel until sunrise, but in a way that gets everyone dancing, the Pied Piper of pirouettes, each reveller a rat hypnotised by my instruments, my legs. I want to say I encourage participation, but sometimes even I lose myself to the rhythm, the bodies around me becoming a blur as I weave like a basket bin at heels. All aboard the Soul Train, may we all happily wank the floor, circle jerking like boarding schoolboys. There's always another party tonight, maybe with a smoke machine and a string quartet doing reggae covers, or my mate's kitchen with a load of East End boys and West End girls. I have to go there now, cheeks flushed, before I turn back into a pumpkin. I kiss the bride on the cheek. I leapfrog the groom one last time, and I disappear into the night like a sliver of night sky. Consider this another floor wanked. On to the next one. Raven Smith's Men was written and read by Raven Smith, abridged by Robin Brooks, produced by Naomi Walmsley.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Raven Smith. Welcome to this abridged version of Raven Smith's Men. I put pen to paper to trace the roots of my masculinity, trying to distill what it is about men that has kept me enthralled and irritated my entire life. I love men, but men are problematic. I also happen to be one. I recount as many of my men as possible, from school jocks, teenage kicks, right through the thicket of my 20s and out the other side. Obviously, my dad is in there, as is my long-suffering husband. Talking about men can get very serious very fast, but before we page Dr. Freud, it's worth mentioning I've had a lot of laughs and a handful of orgasms. Lucky me! Join me as I paint the portrait of my life lived in parallel with other men. I am as curious as I am terrified. Expect sex, expect drugs, expect strong language and bad decisions. Episode 6, The Flatmate. I know that students on a deadline mainline caffeine, but nothing keeps you awake at night like guilt. Like any sentient being, the silly, dumb things that have happened to me intrude my thoughts. Saying the wrong lines in the school play, the time I was mean to my rabbit before she died. There's a special place in my brain for the Amazon review that described my last book as reading the babble coming out of a half-conscious drunk. These dumb little things are side dishes compared to the unpalatably salty main course of roughly chopped guilt. Raw guilt regurgitates. I wish I'd lived a Quaker life, simple and serene, living off the land, oblivious to my own ability to wrong, my power to corrode. I wish I could have my memory erased, like Harold Bishop when he fell off the cliff. I want to be the kind of psychopath who shrugs off other people's feelings, ready to misdemean again. But for me, guilt is a hell of a stimulant in the wee hours, and I feel bad about so many things. By far the worst thing I feel guilty about is the suicide of my flatmate. This is a moment, I believe, when I issue a trigger warning for suicide. It happened in the summer of 2011, and the guilt isn't that he died exactly. It's not that I wish I could have done something the awful night it happened, swooped in and saved the day at the last minute like Superman. It's that, if I'm completely honest, I'm not even sure I knew he was depressed. They say that writing is cathartic, but I don't feel the weighted blanket of guilt lifting as I type. I had no idea he was in a bad place, bad enough to take his own life. How is that possible? The night it happened, I was asleep. It was a weeknight, and I guess the intrusion of regrettable naughties had abated and let me slip into slumber. I woke up at some pitch-black, unknown time to what felt like the whole house shaking. Boom, it went. Boom, boom, boom. I looked out my bedroom window and there were 2 policemen trying to climb into the back garden. "Is this your house?" they shouted. "Yes," I said. "Let us in." There was another wall-shaking boom, and I realised someone was trying to kick in the front door. I remember nothing between my bed and the door. The 3 flights of stairs down to ground level never registered in my memory. I remember being at the door and a load of police dashing past me into the hallway and into the house and calling for my flatmate. They swept the rooms. One of them went in the attic of all places. In the sea of uniformed officers, my estranged ex-boyfriend appeared and quietly said, "I'm so sorry about this, Raven." Aaron and I had had sex a handful of times since we'd broken up about a year before, maybe longer. And although I know it's a notoriously bad idea to have sex with your ex, neither of us seemed fazed by it in the 6 months after we broke up. It wasn't surfacing old feelings. I was definitely not falling back in love with him. One of the times he was wearing an ear cuff, for Christ's sakes. Since things had become more serious with my just-met future husband, I'd stopped seeing my ex. We didn't have a cauterized ending, no exacting closure, but I didn't think there were any loose ends either. I hadn't seen him in I don't know how long, a year maybe, and I can't tell you how it felt to see him standing there in a pride of police, in a hoodie, at stupid o'clock in the morning. 3 minutes ago, maybe less, I'd been asleep. Policemen and women filed back out, receding as quickly as they'd entered, radios blaring. My estranged ex and I sat next to each other on the Chesterfield sofa, and the police asked us lots of questions. I don't remember what they asked. I don't remember what either of us said. All I remember thinking is, this is a fuss over nothing. How melodramatic. I wonder if the front door is damaged. As the blear of sleep lifted, I felt in my deepest guts that this was all a misunderstanding, and I was embarrassed for Aaron, for him making a mountain so big out of a molehill that he called the police in a blind panic, and the officers had tried to kick my door in. I remember him saying he'd called the Samaritans, that my flatmate had been adamant he wanted to end things, that he'd said the world was black, pointless. I'm embarrassed to recall saying, "Are you sure?" I simply could not believe he wanted to die and was about to. It was impossible. "He seemed okay to me," I said. "He's never okay," said Aaron. I remember making coffee, a few officers milling around the house, and then casually, over the radio, we overheard another officer say, "We found the body." The policeman with the radio immediately left us in the living room, conferred briefly with the officers near the coffee pot, and came back. As I think you overheard, we found someone, but we can't say who it is without an official identification from the family. Phew, I immediately thought, it's not him. I'm not sure when it twigged that morning that I realised my flatmate was dead. As the day dawned, the police told us not to tell anyone until there'd been a formal identification. I called my just-met future husband. I called my mum. I called my best mate. I called our third flatmate who owned the house. That seems like a lot of calls, but I don't remember much time passing. I guess time is hard to keep track of when you've been woken up by a battering ram and the police have accidentally revealed they found your flatmate's body. Some kind of police note-taker started taking a statement from Aaron, but as my just-met future husband arrived, Aaron sort of had an ebbing realisation that he was in his ex's house after a year of non-verbal estrangement, after 6 months of post-breakup casual sex. It was obviously weird for everyone. Not to overshadow the awful thing that had happened to my flatmate, that was happening to us all, our lives as we knew them turning to mush in our hands, but the awful thing was too awful to sink in, too painful to even consider in a real way. There's something about deep, deep shock that means you continue to function as the world turns on its head right in front of you. You're offering tea and making some bland aside about Lavazza coffee. I wasn't yet grieving. I wasn't yet devastated. This wasn't a survival tactic. It wasn't consciously coping or distracting myself. It was my motor functions carrying me forward before the grief took me out. The denial was not even denial so much as a voice continually saying, "But I saw him yesterday." Aaron asked the policewoman if he could give his statement in his own home. I was quite keen to hear his side of the story of what happened because my timeline of events started when I woke up, but I also didn't have a clue what the right thing to do was. Should I go with them, with my ex, to his house? My flatmate was fine. How embarrassing for everyone. Aaron left with the policewoman. I called my boss and said I wasn't coming in, hearing my own voice saying, "My flatmate's committed suicide, but they've asked us not to tell anyone," but still not believing it. I slept for 4 numb hours in my boyfriend's bed, in the converted attic of his shared house, and woke up to my best mate calling me. Rather than ask how I was, to try and figure out the labyrinth of what I was going through, she just drove over, put me in her car, and parked me on the sofa in her living room. She didn't ask me any questions. She put on an Adam Sandler film, not even a classically good one, and she let me be. Days passed and the cruel reality of what had happened set in, so much heavier than a sleep blanket. I was inundated with memories of my flatmate, but they all felt shallow. The clothes we liked, the mutual friends we thought were idiots, whether or not Brittany was actually toxic, if she could ever reascend to the heights of her best hit, Baby One More Time. He lived in the tiny box room of our flat share and spent most of his evenings at work in a bar. I worked daytimes when he was home. Loads of housemates barely see each other, right? I'm still trying to work out if it was bad that I hadn't made more time for him. I told myself that I was a tiny part of his life, that we were mutually friendly but not deep. The guilt of that is so piercing. To have lived with someone and not really seen or know them feels wildly unkind, uncaring. I cannot offer you any proper insight into his mental state. Part of the guilt is the lack of anything deeper between us, no true understanding. It's the guilt of not even noticing he was on the brink that will stay with me forever. All that guff about me being emotionally intelligent, it's in the bin. I had no idea he was suffering. I didn't see it coming. I didn't have my own trigger warning. He was suddenly dead. He had taken his own life. We all just had to deal. There were hideous revolutions, convulsions of wanting to turn the clock back, of actually talking to him, of actually listening. The guilt of this manifested as a dull weight in my stomach. Weeks later, I transported that dull stomach lead all the way to his funeral. There are no good funerals, are there? Especially if there are lots of young people dressed in mourning. All that wasted potential, all that undriven mileage on the clock. There was a mild panic as we entered the church because it was packed and I got separated from my party. I ended up sitting next to someone I actively disliked, a guy who seemed to only be able to speak to me as a homosexual, only ever asking me about gay things. I represented nothing more to him, and him putting his unlikable arm around me as I wept. Despite the funeral, that motor functioning shock continued. The disbelief didn't fully lift. A sort of zombie grief propelled me through the trivialities of daily life for a good few months. It stacked up behind me and could not be damned. I remember my mum coming to London for the day and bawling my eyes out over the carrot cake in the John Lewis canteen. 6 months later, I took the stand at the inquest, but it wasn't exciting or dramatic. There was no last-minute revelation. Just a sad death, almost too sad to comprehend, that still felt somehow inevitable. Aaron took to the stand too, describing those months that we were still sleeping together as our detangling. I still like how that sounded. My ex, God bless him, attracted so many damaged people in need, and it turned out my flatmate was another man who needed his attention. My obliviousness to all that will never not feel shameful. Years later, after 3 or so wines, my mum said she didn't really believe the people we'd lost were really dead. I needed that irrational truth, that compassionate lie. Maybe my flatmate isn't dead, not in the cripplingly finite, harshly real way. Maybe he's just somewhere I can't see him. He won't be back, but he's okay. I must confess, I still believe. Raven Smith's Men was written and read by Raven Smith, abridged by Robin Brooks, produced by Naomi Walmsley.
I'm Elizabeth Day.
I'm Johnny Pitts.
And we present Radio 4's Open Book. Join us on BBC Sounds if you love to read and want to discover what brilliant books to pick up next.
From Booker Prize winners to the hottest debuts, listen to our conversations with the most exciting authors telling us about their creative inspirations. We're here to help you grow your bookshelves, expand your horizons,
and escape into a great book. Open Book with Elizabeth Day and Johnny Pitts on BBC Sounds.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Raven Smith. Welcome to this abridged version of Raven Smith's Men. I put pen to paper to trace the roots of my masculinity, trying to distill what it is about men that has kept me enthralled and irritated my entire life. I love men, but men are problematic. I also happen to be one. I recount as many of my men as possible, from school jocks, teenage kicks, right through the thicket of my 20s and out the other side. Obviously, my dad is in there, as is my long-suffering husband. Talking about men can get very serious very fast, but before we page Dr. Freud, it's worth mentioning I've had a lot of laughs and a handful of orgasms. Lucky me! Join me as I paint the portrait of my life lived in parallel with other men. I am as curious as I am terrified. Expect sex, expect drugs, expect strong language and bad decisions. Episode 7, Spotted Dick. My husband Richard is everywhere in this book. He's hiding somewhere in each mannish chapter, stirred through my life like the currents in a spotted dick. I first spotted Dick, or Dickie, on the night bus, on another night of shuttling across London on public transport for a party. It's odd to think of a time when my husband was just some guy, just tallish and funny-ish, and certainly not, at the time, a vessel for my personal sense of satisfaction and a mirror for my shortcomings, a constant test for my patience and compassion. In Dalston, on the top deck of the 243, I was unaware I had just met my future husband. I was not looking for love. Being a bachelor and cruising other bachelors has a certain panned-out quality in that you meet men in person but never really get close. You never have to commit. I was ostrich to myself, ear deep in my own sand. I did not take to Richard like a duck to water, yet here we are, a decade later, married and sharing a domestic pond, an emotional farmyard. I remember my 20s as a series of unrequited lovers, the ones that got away. Richard is the one that didn't get away, but I cannot tell you how and why it worked out. Somewhere between casual sex and authentic boyfriending, something clicked, something twigged, and I can't for the life of me remember what. It was gentle, and each progressive step into coupledom lacked the emotional turmoil I'd become so accustomed to. I wonder what he saw in me, the young raven full of shit. Bravado, maybe? In 2010, nobody wanted no scrubs, and yet I somehow was one, living hand to mouth and night to night in incredibly small and cheap clothes. When I met Richard, I was a month out of living on my mate's sofa. I was happily, almost proudly restless, but my rip-it-all-up mentality wasn't sustainable. Those days are behind me. I have roots now. Not to blow too much smoke up his arse, but Richard is dependable and patient, supporting my bouts of hardcore typing, long periods isolated and writing, my unrelenting procrastination. I blame my mood swings and character defects on Mercury in retrograde, and Richard nods along, knowing I'm just hungry. He turns the other cheek while I'm checking in my eye bags at the airport. He supports my failed digital detoxes. Richard has always been Mr. Hyperbole. We're always on the best holiday we've ever been on. This is always the best meal he's ever eaten. Whenever something good happens, it's the best day of his life. And like most people, Richard's best qualities are also his Achilles heel. I don't want to startle you, but I am no saint, and I have my own bad qualities. My husband is very measured. He's also both silly and serious. Sometimes I get trivial Richard, two cheeky girls sewn together at a hen do when I need a serious man, a politician. It's still, after all these years, Interesting to me that we don't always agree, even though I am always right. Richard's categorically not one for arguments. He will avoid them like the plague. His conflict-avoidant state has been known to let things fester, to ferment, to bubble up to the point of Etna eruption. I like to have things out almost immediately, cards on the table. What really hurts is knowing that I would do anything to stop this man getting hurt, and yet I seem to be one of his main agitators, the reason for his turbulence. Nitpicking, scab-picking, getting drunk and being my worst self. He's seen it all. Richard and I live a relatively drama-free life, retreating from the chaos of the outside world into our stable for two, our personal world of interiors, a joint but healthy agoraphobia. As a teen, I assumed lack of conversation was a sign of relationship decay, a gesture of drifting apart, but I realised that quietness is a sign of the work, the comfort, the closeness. I thought in my 20s that I'd rather die than be predictable, but predictability is the epicenter of long-term love, the ever-thine sex that floods your body with endorphins rather than performative, acrobatic birthday shagging. During a rough patch a few years back, communication dwindled and I felt us drifting apart. It was incredibly scary. I want to say it's all cleared up now, and for the most part, we are back on track. But no matter how happy you are, coasting can mean less vigilance. So sometimes the car skids, and you have to take a moment to correct the course. During this particular skid, I complained to a friend that Richard had diluted me. The friend suggested that I needed watering down at this point, that I was erratic and flighty, that maybe a little less of that was not negative. Water, I realised, isn't the enemy. Richard hadn't been diluting me, he'd been hydrating me. This sounds so naff to my jaded, cynical ears, I want to delete it immediately, but it's absolutely true. He somehow saved me from myself. I've always been as chaotic as I am driven, but Richard became a reason to build upwards, rather than constantly spreading out. The rootless Raven of 2010 was fun. My God, he was fun. But the weathered, good condition, slightly used Raven gets to be home with Richard on a Saturday night with a spotted dick at the back of the fridge waiting to be reheated. I am not 2010 Raven. He is not the same dick I spotted. Yet here we are. It still works. We're in the car, together, jointly vigilant for ice patches. When you're writing a book, reading for pleasure can be difficult, which I appreciate is quite a privileged issue to have. The planet is simmering, democracy is evaporating, boatloads of people are seeking asylum, and poor Raven can't enjoy 3 pages of Gone Girl without it playing into some existential feedback loop. Not enjoying reading felt, at the time, like a big issue, bigger than realising I'd probably never nail the splits, despite multiple watches of splits for beginners on YouTube. I know splits people are the worst, but I simply can't wait to be one. Do you think there's people out there that can do the splits and haven't told anybody? I do not. Anyway, the dog-eared novels, the essays of hot takes, the audiobooks narrated by notable voices all became more threatening than inspiring. I felt like a backing singer with his mic off, struggling to reach the high notes. Things went in. I was collating data, but nothing that came out felt like enough. Concepts festered within me like a shoal of tapeworms. I was blocked. I tried to be open to creativity. I went for long nature-adjacent walks like a Bronte sister in a reassuringly expensive tracksuit. I stroked my cat, usually a cure-all for any woes, but still I didn't write. In the midst of the writer's block, I found myself somewhere up the Nile, near the Aswan Dam, on a lounger by the pool of the hotel where Agatha Christie novelled in the 30s. I know nothing gets me out of a writing funk like David Sedaris. Creamed against mosquitoes and feeling the full benefit of a long sit-down, I fingered a Sedaris paperback. His latest book was mundane and mesmerising, flowery but precise, confessional but objective. 2 pages in, and I was ready to type again. David Sedaris is the uncle you prayed for who arrives on Christmas afternoon. His gift is lively anecdotes you nurse over eggnog. His prose makes me sick with envy for its sheer accuracy. Like all good people, he's fluent in cynicism, but his begrudging hope shines through like a grease spot on a napkin. No shade to the man, but it's astounding to me that I still like David Sedaris. You would think that at some point he'd have done something small and disconcerting, a bad oyster in his fruits de mer, and I'd be allergic to his dishes for 7 years at least. We all do this, right? Look for weaknesses. I make it difficult for people to be close by needling them with my inquiries into their actions, by questioning their word use. My husband just wants to be loved. He wants an easy dinner and a snuggle and the cure-all of a cat stroke. But some nights I can't stop myself deconstructing the true meaning of how he operates, his texts during the day, the way he said hello when he came in, his insatiable appetite for work. I have been known to excavate long-buried fossils of discontent. Everything he's ever done, past and present, has an intrinsically negative net value. And what does that argument we had in Bill's in Bath in 2014 mean for our future, Richard? What about what you said in passing at our wedding? I can see this toxic puddle spreading out like spilt milk, but I don't cry over it. I just get angrier. Anger is sadness for people who think they're strong. It's not just writing with its paper cuts of judgment that can make me feel not enough. When the stars align, everything leaves me feeling frustratingly impotent. Not smart enough, not funny enough, not sharp enough or fast enough. My accuracy in the bin. I don't call my mum enough or engage in the group WhatsApp enough. I'm not woke enough. I'm not worldly enough. I'm not successful enough. I'm not ambitious enough. I am not enough. Some voice in the cheap seats at the back of my brain keeps telling me that challenging other people brings personal security. I'm safer when I probe because the focus shifts away from my inadequacy. Of course, it's impossible to be fully understood by someone else. To have anyone keep up when I can barely get a grasp of myself is futile. But like all romantic relationships, I put much higher expectations on whether I'm making my husband happy and he me. It's much easier to rationalise the human fault in my mates because I don't expect them to serve my deepest needs, to be the pinnacle of my sense of satisfaction and achievement and emotional well-being. Not to mention money and shelter, sexual gratification, the need for ongoing sparkling banter. But we all still expect godlike adoration from our partner. The two of you a congregation of mutual worship, both of you deities and true believers. I still want to be a god in my husband's eyes, but I'm a guy in a hoodie on a laptop in a sea of empty coffee cups. Real life gets in the way of hero worship. And despite this understanding, I can't stop. What is it that keeps me constantly challenging men I love, refusing to accept the truth of our inevitable humanizing? Why am I so desperate to remind myself I'm somehow other and outsider? There's a brute symmetry to our lives, Sedaris and I. He is gay and I am gay. Sedaris' life is nothing like the life I've had or continue to strive for. There's the reckoning with addiction, the tragicomic family peppered with siblings, a house in the Cape. But we both have coming out stories, periods in the closet. And then there's that quietly exasperated husband, Hugh, married to a loudmouth. That feels startlingly familiar. Words are clay, and I like David's pots. It's easier to enjoy Sedaris because I don't need to be enough for him. I just need to passively read his words. Right there, in Egypt, on a lounger by the pool of the hotel where Agatha Christie novelled in the 30s, I only had to absorb. Right here, right now, I only have to type. Maybe that's enough. Raven Smith's Men was written and read by Raven Smith, abridged by Robin Brooks, produced by Naomi Walmsley.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Raven Smith. Welcome to this abridged version of Raven Smith's Men. I put pen to paper to trace the roots of my masculinity, trying to distill what it is about men that has kept me enthralled and irritated my entire life. I love men, but men are problematic. I also happen to be one. I recount as many of my men as possible, from school jocks, teenage kicks, right through the thicket of my 20s and out the other side. Obviously, my dad is in there, as is my long-suffering husband. Talking about men can get very serious very fast, but before we page Dr. Freud, it's worth mentioning I've had a lot of laughs and a handful of orgasms. Lucky me! Join me as I paint the portrait of my life lived in parallel with other men. I am as curious as I am terrified. Expect sex, expect drugs, expect strong language and bad decisions. Episode 8, Dangerous Liaisons. It's usually an unprecedented horniness that gets you back on the market after a breakup, but casual sex only stretches so far before the elastic gets taut. After the bit, when your heart's brittle like cold day toffee, after you've listened to your song until your ears bleed, after you cry puke in the toilets of a pub on a Saturday afternoon, after you decide your ex is criminally insane, you're ready to pound coin the foil off the scratch card of romantic possibility. You realise, slightly begrudgingly, that you're ready for love again, which is possibly a Donna Summer song. Like a glamour girl leaving I'm a Celebrity, you're ready for the next chapter. You're ready for the anniversaries rather than you up texts, for the masturbation to be mutual, communal even, for someone to make love to you, not just your holes. There are so many different ways to fall in love, head over heels or arse over tit. And personal readiness doesn't always convert into a relationship. You can be open to the universe giving you love, your heart unziplocked and defrosting. You can be single but self-actualizing, saying affirmations in the mirror like Candyman and right-swiping your tits off. You can be actively window shopping suitors with the zeal of Sonic getting rings. But the stars staunchly refuse to align. It just doesn't go to plan. Love, regrettably, is a game of chance, and rolling the dice doesn't always get you a Yahtzee. The likelihood of falling in love, or finding someone to love you back, doesn't instantaneously quadruple because you're wearing nice pants and waxing full time. The energy it takes to be new shag ready 24/7 is so exhausting that you're bound to slip. There'll be nights when you take your eye off the ball, diverting your attention entirely to the champagne and trays of those fiddly sandwiches held together with little sticks. You'll feel woozy and free and something in your pants will stir. This is when you'll bump into a charming prince, possibly the one, but you're too horny, like Moose T horny, and you ruin it all with your urges. I was, initially, quite comfortable in the no man's land of being single, in the abyss of sexual penury in dick poverty. I was neither furiously rutting strangers on days with a Y, nor settling down with a decent chap. Decent chaps like to furiously rut too. I was a perennial fuckboy in waiting, lacking whatever special sauce it takes to have a string of eligible bachelors in my DMs. I have a habit of making men nervous, which isn't great for obtaining and sustaining erections, them, not me. But I was still keen on trial and erroring boyfriends, and I did meet a few men of note. There was the neighbour who ate my art in such an exquisite way I wanted to write poetry, but I didn't like his home decor, especially a rather nasty desk where, one assumes, he sat perfecting his analingus on a peach, so I gently stopped responding to his messages. I had a few dates with a man who'd had a stroke and couldn't get it up, not sure if that was a correlation. Younger men are always eager to fuck, very enthusiastic, but they're not, on the whole, brilliant at it. They seem so excited to have their mouth on your dick that they either neglect to follow up with any discernible technique or rip something off porn that's hugely aggressive and doesn't feel nice. Men, like snowflakes, are all different. You can find yourself going through the motions with a man as he half dissociates and has sex with the component parts of your body like he's painting by numbers. You're together, but he's not there. Not really. These men treat nearly everything as a pit stop to penetrative sex, a perfunctory action, almost mindless, like rinsing a glass before you put it in the dishwasher. At this point, I'd like to say thank you to my neighbour for realising that my bumhole isn't an entree. It's not a snack. It's a whole damn meal. Who are my other regrettable fumbles? Oh, the guy who ran a nightclub I loved in a working men's club and came home with me and then suddenly froze and left. I only got to the bottom of it 20 years later when a mutual friend said he'd seen the posters of his night on my wall and told everybody I was obsessed with him. I'm still livid, frankly. There was the guy who told me he was in love with his best mate, who was also his flatmate, and was sort of spying on him, which terminated my desire instantaneously. And further back, before I could even hold my alcohol, I met dozens of men who didn't fit the bill. Not quite. Guys in liberal outfits, underlaid with Tory underwear, rich boys who spoke with an affected, I'm not rich lilt like Bert from Mary Poppins. I've dated some under-evolved men. I've had a few troglodytes. I once made out with a man who was essentially a balloon on a stick with a smiley face drawn on it. One guy was nothing more than a sentient baby bell. There's something about reality that's always let me down, and I found myself, over the years, enjoying the ambient idea of a passionate relationship with people I don't quite know, the fantasy shags, rather than the precise reality of the men. Earlier on in my relationship with my now husband, these intensive fantasies about other men terrified me with their white-hot obsession. I assumed that they had some meaning, proved something was missing at home. But my crushes, for crushes they were, always fizzled out. They never found purchase. It was the danger of the fantasy infidelity that I loved, not the actual infidelity. And rather than berate myself for this grass is greener parallel fantasy life, I now indulge in it. It's harmless. It never converts to an actionable list, nor would I want it to. It's an impossibly hot fantasy precisely because it's impossible. We all do this, I hope. I don't think we fantasize about real life. It defeats the point because there's something a bit unhorny about over-familiarity. It's still erotic in its own way at home, but it doesn't match the fantasy of the fantasy. That's why the fantasy is needed. I don't think we masturbate over our partners, over the comforts of the existences we already inhabit. I have yet to finish myself off to a shepherd's pie and a back rub, lovely as they are. We wank for implausible couplings, for impossible conquests, for dangerous liaisons. There's a guy I barely know who lives in New York. Let's call him Peter. Peter is his name. Peter and I have been DMing so long I can't remember who started it. We're talking maybe 7 years. I don't wank over Peter, though I'm sure he understands my arse is not an entree, because the fantasy is much more domestic. I'm certain I'd be married to him if I wasn't with my husband, though Peter's never given any suggestion he liked me back, never hinted we're anything more than sassy commenting DM friends. Sorry to this man, but I've pinned some rather unrealistic expectations onto him. It's an imaginary relationship that's never once felt real and is therefore completely safe. He's miles away. He's partnered too. It's fail-safe. In my mind, I'm imagination married to Peter. In my mind, it's going great. Our made-up marriage is problem-free. I don't remember the wedding exactly, but at weekends we often sail on our yacht and dock in those little towns up the Hudson. In reality, people are always telling me to shush, to take it down a notch, but that doesn't happen in my Peter marriage. Our days on the boat idle by. Imagination life is serene, and I don't have the ever-present fear that I'm about to be made bankrupt by single servings of bread and butter pudding from Whole Foods. In recent years, in real life, outside my mind, Peter's worked out a lot. He succumbed to the fate of many a gay man and got buff. But our fake marriage isn't belittled by gym sessions and protein shakes. The muscle is there without the work. Imagination Peter loves culture. He tinkles on the piano on the boat and writes stanzas devoted to me. I am his muse, but in a cool way. Sometimes I lay on the piano in a tux and we sing duets. I never miss a note. Peter inspires my writing too. I'm not pretentious enough to write with a quill, but I manage a really nice Parker rollerball with blue ink for flair. Radio 4 murmurs as I catch up on my correspondences, deftly wielding those envelope knives posh people have for letters, a dressing gown revealing an appropriate amount of ankle, the perfect balance of sense and sensibility. I don't know if I work from a cabin office with a porthole or on deck, or where Peter is at this point, because fantasies don't have the same rigorous continuity as Hollywood films. But the day unfolds as I effortlessly deposit 1,500 words into a Word doc. Often we meet for sundowner drinks on deck, something amber-coloured in a tumbler as the stars come out. There's 4th of July fireworks every night, which, being an American, Peter loves, and we eat charred sausages from the barbecue. Halfway down a rum sour, he kisses me. Do we all dream of the lives we don't have? Not so much covet what we see, but construct a fantasy with minimal base in reality. We can make ourselves potty, dreaming of the one that got away, though I don't think the rimming to the point of poetry guy was a missed opportunity. But getting dumped always shuts down a route into the future you were banking on, leaving a huge what if in its path. An imagination marriage is a benign antidote to reality, an impossible dream encased in amber, never stress-tested by the stresses of real life. It's a nugget of yearning that you can massage whenever it takes your fancy. There's a safety in the fantasy marriage, less the one that got away, more the one that never was. I have a wee confession. I actually met real Peter in the flesh once. I convinced him to take me out for lunch in Manhattan on his work account while I was on a commission in New York. We met at some expensive vegan place and the similarities between us were startling. Same height, same bomber, we'd both just given up sugar, we even had the same fucking shoes. Rather than fear we'd human centipede after the main course, no pudding because sugar ban, my main takeaway was that real Peter can never meet my real Richard, my real husband. Real Peter and I are so startlingly similar, I think real Richard would leave me for him. A massive curveball for my imaginary marriage, a total catastrophe. I can see it so clearly, Richard and imagination Peter on the boat, gazing at the fireworks and feeding each other chunks of sausage, making out after the sours. I actually feel a bit sick. I'm able to survey this hideous scene and also be miles away and alone, continuity be damned. Cut to me somewhere much less fancy, dining by myself, probably lobster and fries to cheer myself up, and one of those tragic little plastic bibs. The lobster may spatter, but there's nobody else there to care. That feels desperately sad because it is lonely lobster for one. That's the main problem with a fantasy. You can't transfer it to real life. It can't live up to the dream. The more real you make it, the less thrilling it is, and you end up alone, crying into your lobster. Raven Smith's Men was written and read by Raven Smith, abridged by Robin Brooks, produced by Naomi Walmsley.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Raven Smith. Welcome to this abridged version of Raven Smith's Men. I put pen to paper to trace the roots of my masculinity, trying to distill what it is about men that has kept me enthralled and irritated my entire life. I love men, but men are problematic. I also happen to be one. I recount as many of my men as possible, from school jocks, teenage kicks, right through the thicket of my 20s and out the other side. Obviously, my dad is in there, as is my long-suffering husband. Talking about men can get very serious very fast, but before we page Dr. Freud, it's worth mentioning I've had a lot of laughs and a handful of orgasms. Lucky me! Join me as I paint the portrait of my life lived in parallel with other men. I am as curious as I am terrified. Expect sex, expect drugs, expect strong language and bad decisions. Episode 9, Lean In. Dig, if you will, the picture of you and I engaged in a kiss. One when we first wake up, before I've had a chance to brush my teeth. A kiss is punctuation in the lifelong stage production of love, two soliloquies coming together. Is there anything more embarrassing than someone not returning a kiss? Your tongue in the empty cavity of their mouth, searching for a response, for vital signs like an episode of Holby City. One kiss is all it takes, but two people have to be complicit to make it work. These partisan kisses don't happen in the movies. Two people are always secretly in love with each other, whether or not they know it. The entire narrative on screen is just foreplay for that first returned kiss. Hold me, thrill me, kiss me, kill me. Maybe I can blame the movies for my kiss failures because Hollywood warps the reality of love. It's Lady and the Tramp's fault. It's Pretty Woman's. It's Britney's and Madonna's. I blame cinema for making my kiss preamble more of a pre-scramble and perpetuating that ominous idea of stealing a kiss, which is cut through with menace. Kisses are things to take rather than share. Cinema taught me that everyone wants to kiss me but can't quite find the words. If every character is gagging to be kissed, how could I possibly tell if someone real doesn't want to? I want to somehow make amends for those poor unfortunate souls, casualties of the lean in, for each time I misread the signs, for speeding forward on a red light. Leaning in to kiss someone who's not up for it is absolutely mortifying, especially if you peek for a split second and see the terror in the whites of their eyes. You've gone inside the equations in someone else's head and got the wrong calculation, the wrong answer. I've never cajoled or coaxed when a kiss isn't returned. I've just stayed absolutely still like I'm being hunted by jungle cats and waited for the ground to swallow me up whole. Please God, may this essay exorcise my lean-in shame so I may walk this earth unburdened. I have no ingrained ability to woo. I have no skills for it. I was never a notorious Lothario. I never had a string of Saturday night dates or love interest to juggle on a carefully timed rotation. And even though I can see that being a Casanova as a long-term scheme is emotionally net negative, I would have liked the choice to opt out of numerous, varied novelty shags. Annoyingly, I came of age in the golden era of pulling. All the clubs, all the foam nights, all the belly tops, all the street mate. You'd think I'd have learned the ropes while reading More magazine and guides to Sealing the Deal in Loaded. It was a time of great gendering, but that division exacerbated the desire to fuck. Pre-shagging was in the air, an opaque gas, rather than invisibly online. There were lads and ladettes. Everyone was boisterous and up for it, booze and sex. Everything was up for grabs apart from sleep, you bore. Breakfasts were big, fat boys were slim. Zoe Ball was pictured swigging Jack Daniels in her jeans en route to her wedding. We had metrosexuals, a predecessor to spawnosexuals, men who sportily conditioned their bodies into a pornographic aesthetic. People read nuts, unironically. Children's TV presenters took their kit off in nuts, unironically, because it was a public graduation ceremony from Blue Peter, an entry fee to post-pub primetime TV gigs. Brands started marketing products that had no Y chromosomes in rigorously gendered campaigns. Yorkie, which I think of as the eunuch of chocolates, was not for girls. We all ate Man Crisps and drove past billboards of humongous and inviting Hello Boys breasts. Cadbury's had a drumming gorilla that reeked of testosterone. Clubbing was a legitimate personality like pizza is now. We'd go out to dance, code for cop off. Everyone learned witty but quasi-misogynistic chat-up lines, unlike today when you're lucky to get a you up text at 1 a.m. When you kissed someone in an inebriated multitask before the dawn of social media, you had to try and remember their face and get their number. Watching your mate get her phone out and share her number with a guy would elicit a cheer. Flirting was a sport, chirpsing was encouraged, but there were different grades of schmoozing, and some people had all class A's while I smoked nutmeg through a cloggy bong. Perhaps it was the rampant straightness that inhibited my erotic potential. My potency was somehow diluted in a sea of straights. I watched the greatest players of my generation playing, but I couldn't muster the catalytic conversion from fellow clubber to awkward breakfast date. I was forever pre-coital. Courting always felt like a dance I had never quite learned the steps to. I never found the beat. Internalized homophobia was rife in my early dalliances. I think that's what held me back. Objectively, being gay was fine. I had come to terms with the idea of it, but I felt like a driver who had only passed the theory test. I was okay with the sex act itself, but I wanted the intimacy of two people, the little glances, the micro affections, the tender pillow talk. It's hard to convey that in any real way at 2 a.m. when the lights come up in a filthy beer room and there's already a cloakroom queue. I'd love to say that the lean-in kiss is a product of drinking, but I stand by the adage, usually applied to bar brawlers, that if it's not in you when you're sober, it won't come out when you're drunk. I was imbued with an incredible neediness that couldn't be contained when I'd had a pint or two. During the day, I was a functioning safeaholic, anti any expression of vulnerability, suppressing the openness it takes to be seen and loved. In an act of bizarre retaliation to the fathomless possibilities of the gay experience, if only you can let yourself go, I started to think of myself as a superior type of gay, and by that I mean a straight guy who happened to like men but certainly didn't need them. Liking men was a cool strength, but broadcasting my emotional availability like an estate agent was my Achilles heel, the weak link in my personal brand of being fun and carefree. I was terrified of being read as gay from a distance, and in turn, distanced myself from other gays. I could potentially put a man into my mouth or arse, but not into my heart, because it felt like a threat to my very being. Rather than allow men in, I just got very, very emotionally insular, with explosive pockets of please, please kiss me, I'm incredibly lonely. A detonation of vulnerability that was so intense it cancelled out any potential horniness from a suitor. I remember a guy saying, "I like you, but you're so needy," and then I promptly circled the party asking everyone I knew if they thought I was needy, which might be the neediest outcome. Despite a rigid commitment to coolness, I somehow couldn't manage to play it cool with men. I was too locked down and then suddenly too unlocked, scrabbling to close the gate after the horse had bolted. Rather than throwing up a flume of lukewarm flat gin and tonic on the pavement, I was Niagaraing brutal honesty. Honesty is great once you're married because it's the key to a true union, but getting to the altar, or just the bedroom, needs some mystique. Mystique here means a web of half-truths and gaps in knowledge that the other person fills with projected fantasy. I am annoyingly unpersuasive. I am blag-free. I am not one for smoke and mirrors, for falsehoods, for fantasies. In a way, I was deliberately not getting good at pulling because it felt so staged, so fraudulent. I occasionally pulled, but I certainly didn't learn to pull. I didn't glean any understanding of what another person might want. I didn't make the time to learn the trade, to examine the nuances of courtship, because they all felt like micro-assaults to my sense of strength. I was a rock. I was an island. I didn't need joining to the mainland. I have no idea what I was doing while everyone else was learning the foxtrot towards the bedroom. I guess I was just at home, covered in burger sauce, harbouring crushes for straight men. Despite my aversion for traditional gayness, I inevitably joined the ranks of the most foolish, the gays who fancy straights. The delicious flavour of unrequited love is that it keeps you completely safe because it never has to survive outside the fertile incubator of your own mind. It is a clever thing, your brain, hitting you with MSG-enhanced emotions without you ever having to be the slightest bit vulnerable. It's not that boring stuff like work seeps into real love, it's just that in an imagination relationship, you only have passionate arguments that you always win, and you only have passionate sex that never hurts. There's a way in which you can construct an entire fantasy around a straight man, and the reason it's not happening is because he's straight. So you never have to address any flaws in yourself apart from being the wrong gender. It's a piercing, insurmountable pain, but my God, it's addictive. When you're suppressing your need to be vulnerable, straight men can seem like the path to salvation, but they're the quickest route to melancholy. I have always had this underlying feeling that I'm not pretty, not in a conventional way. I've always been a tall glass of water, but I don't think I'm alone in being post-adolescent and secretly thinking I'm ugly. Like I was making do with what I had, rather than flourishing in a way that someone would put on the cover of a magazine. I know capitalism is set up to make us feel unpretty, like we're not enough. It keeps us hooked on the promised elevations of under-eye rollerballs and jazzy shirts. Traditional archetypes of beauty centre on the blonde and the blue-eyed, and I was the opposite of that, something I now try to wear as a badge of honour. My unrun-of-the-mill unboringness. I boast that I'm an acquired taste, but I'd still love a day being catalogue hot and turning straight men into my playthings. I'm unconventionally handsome, maybe, and definitely tall, which is a bonus. My early 20s were completely different to my late teens, when I finally started to realise the power of my differences. I realised I had about 10 seconds to pour a glass of sparkling personality for a potential mate before I'd lose them to someone prettier and quieter and less funny who left more gaps in the conversation for romantic projection. I had a tiny window to vomit my pithiest one-liner before they'd be gone like sand through the hourglass. I didn't realise the superpower of individuality when I was young. I muddled through, and it's a relief to look back and realise that even though I was objectively hotter, teenage collagen is a balm, I wasn't happier. I wasn't closer to people. I couldn't approach anyone with confidence. I couldn't talk with irreverent purpose. I couldn't find the common ground. Instead, in my quest to protect myself, I fell into staccato sentences and leaned in for an unwelcome kiss. Raven Smith's Men was written and read by Raven Smith, abridged by Robin Brooks, produced by Naomi Walmsley.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Raven Smith. Welcome to this abridged version of Raven Smith's Men. I put pen to paper to trace the roots of my masculinity, trying to distill what it is about men that has kept me enthralled and irritated my entire life. I love men, but men are problematic. I also happen to be one. I recount as many of my men as possible, from school jocks, teenage kicks, right through the thicket of my 20s and out the other side. Obviously, my dad is in there, as is my long-suffering husband. Talking about men can get very serious very fast, but before we page Dr. Freud, it's worth mentioning I've had a lot of laughs and a handful of orgasms. Lucky me! Join me as I paint the portrait of my life lived in parallel with other men. I am as curious as I am terrified. Expect sex, expect drugs, expect strong language and bad decisions. Episode 10, The Revelations of Raven Smith. I get off on realising shit. It is my kink. I love the vigorous knit shampoo of a good realisation, the world shifting beneath my feet. Revelations have a habit of surging up like water in a storm drain, saturating you with their clarity and then receding, all but forgotten. While you're soaked to the bone, they feel vital, urgent. For me, it's been a huge week for realising shit. I'm reeling from epiphanies. The ground beneath me has shifted beyond recognition. It's liquefied and turned into Glastonbury mush. Anything can trigger these worldview tilts. Normally it's a podcast with a charismatic host, but I also thank my therapist for teasing them out as I lay back in bed and siphon off my emotional effluvium. There are so many things we do together, my therapist and I, that are naff, genuinely naff. It's annoying to me that they work because most of it sets off my bullshit detector. We sometimes do a visualization of me floating above a situation to get perspective. My sessions always involve some tiny assault to my ego, a passing comment, a slow response to a WhatsApp that has sent me spiraling. My therapist and I do imagined visits to my wiser self, a much more laid-back version of Raven Smith who doesn't fret so. I have also identified talismans of wiser Raven so I can carry him with me as I continually fuck up. It's very meta. Therapy is incredibly interesting to you as you have it, but sort of boring to read about, so let's not dwell. Just know that these sessions have a cumulative effect, and I have been gathering most of my shit together and managing the percolating anxiety that comes with being alive. Recently, as I've gained a certain notoriety on and offline, I have been troubled. This modicum of fame has left me reeling. Where I once happily chatted to a group of actual friends doing private in-jokes, my broadcast has got bigger, my sentiments are amplified, and I've begun to hear myself echoed back. This isn't a bad thing exactly, and it's not a brag, it's just something that's happening. I like a chat, and I like a laugh, and new people thrill me, but I can feel a dread brewing of being too glib, too insincere, too one-dimensional. I think of my platform, physically, a great floor high up where each edge has a sheer drop. I'm not famous enough to get cancelled, so I don't tend to worry about that, but I have this ceaseless irk, this whining gripe. I feel like I'm being misunderstood. I have a desperate need to be thought of as smart, sharp, something more than a knotted string of jokes like a butcher's sausage. When I speak to people, most often in my DMs, I can tell they're disappointed I'm not compulsively cracking jokes or being sassy, and in certain times scoff at my intention to be at all serious. You know from this book that I'm more than jokes, more than quips, not an infinite jester, and it's this disconnect that riles me. The me that surfs the waves of complexity and the audience that just want to giggle. It was like this in primary school too. I went out of my way to be funny, and I was livid when my occasional sincerity was rebuffed or ignored. Any potential power of my voice was diluted because it always came in a comedic wrapper. I had set myself up as funny, and it stopped me being anything else. I've been able to balance this out as an adult, to be deliberately slower, more measured. Not everything needs a savage retort. Not everyone wants a searing hot take. Sometimes people just want to be properly heard, rather than ammunition for your next quip. This, my friends, is one of my revelations. I've had some spats online, people who are woke to the point of utter joylessness, anti-vaxxers with an axe to grind, men who seem solely focused on banging my husband. As a byproduct of notoriety, people say nice things to you. This, again, is no bad thing, but I find the admiration hard to stomach. I asked my therapist, what if I continue to deflect every compliment lobbed at me until they completely dry up? We, as yet, have no counter-affirmation. My wiser self is stumm. But something about compliments makes me feel even less understood. Like, if we're all laughing together, you're missing my deep wells of, well, deepness. And then something clicked. I was talking to my coach about wanting love and feeling fraudulent when I received it, and I realised that it's women whose compliments don't hit, not the men. The women. The Glastonbury mud at my feet was suddenly quicksand. I realised that this whole adoration-affirmation issue was gendered. Women could praise me until the cows came home, and I couldn't absorb it because I was still searching for male validation. How fucked up is that? I am surrounded by brilliant women who both support me and build me up. My mother, who raised me, bosses who saw my potential and hired me and promoted me, a circle of friends who genuinely, unquestioningly want me to succeed. Women are my scaffolding, raising me up, my cheerleaders, urging me forward. Yes, men are cheerleaders too, but it's women who have truly pioneered me. Women are my life jacket on the rapids of life, and yet I'm still out here searching for male confirmation. The realisation hit with a dull thud and an unscheduled panic attack. My own patriarchal conditioning is much deeper than I expected, and actually stating all this out loud feels deeply embarrassing. I thought I had this equality thing nailed. I've spent so long deliberately equalising men and women in my mind, getting the bubble right in the middle of the spirit level. I've spent so many years carefully living a woke life, so many nights dressing for myself, so many instances proving I'm more than my testosterone. I simply hadn't noticed this critical gender divide in my thinking. I don't think I need to relearn the brilliance of women. I already know it in my bones. I live it in theory and in practice, but it's men I want to please. I am a voracious taster of men with quite the evolved palate, but I didn't realise how much I needed them, how integral they have become to my way of being, the fluctuations of my emotions. Men come in many forms, and I sniff out more. I find myself squinting at their little avatar on a private profile, wondering if the man has mileage. I see the feral puddles of muscle you meet on apps, young men who've been jaded by scrolling and are doggedly fortified against mainstream mating rituals, opaquely sexual and anti-emotive. The loose men you meet on apps are the worst. They're either 25 and terrible in bed or aggressively assertive, asking to be called daddy in the first message. It's not that I'm not aroused, that I'm above the sexual trigger of absolute filth, but it's the dragon of platonic union I chase too. I think about travelling the world in 80 days as Michael Palin's plucky sidekick. of being the great man behind every great Obama, I think about Elton on a Barocca day. I want, in some small way, for these men to fall for me, to want me for my body or wit or my intellect, to think I dress nicely or hold myself well or just appreciate that I'm tall. I'll take their fleeting respect. I'll take their momentary esteem. I am not meant to admit this. I am meant to be better. It is an excruciating revelation, worse than the time I wet myself on stage in the school play. I cannot tell you where my need for constant affirmation from men came from, but it may well be the screaming subtext of everything I've ever posted, and possibly, depressingly, everything I've ever said out loud. Getting men to notice me has exhausted my adrenal glands as I vie for their approval, a personal dancing plague with the subtext of "watch me twirl, daddy." I have a slow, icky feeling that this is all stemming from my relationship with my dad, and that all the men I encounter are but mere avatars for that unresolved situation. But I don't have another therapy session until next Tuesday, so I type on. Men have become a near constant focus of my attention. It is ridiculous. In an act of sabotage, I find myself competing with men, comparing myself to them. On days when I do yoga and swerve carbs, I might be feeling quite hot, quite handsome, but scrolling past a picture of John Cortajanera can see me derailed like there's a leaf on the line. I'm back to thinking about men, how I can be a better one, how I can win more over. Is there a word for this? Is this textbook narcissism? A little voice is whispering daddy again. Part of me is worried that this is a surface fixation all about sex appeal and appearances, but don't fret. Some of my biggest male rivals are intellectually annoying too. As someone who's incredibly fond of serenading a group with the sweet ditty of an anecdote, I'm aware that that can become competitive with certain chaps. I have been known to quietly describe a really good mate as having too many anecdotes. I am a really bad friend. I cannot tell you which of my beliefs are indigenous to growing up under the male gaze, the flora and fauna of the patriarchy. I do not know the moment when this masculinity obsession was conceived. Men are scented candles, I tell myself, and honestly, at this point in our evolution, is anyone actually in need of a scented candle? They're lovely and can enhance a mood, but you can do that on your own. Candles and men are not at all necessary. I have to admit that the people I admire most are men. I'm rethinking if that's true because I would happily walk across broken glass for Donna Tartt. I would make a pact with the sea witch for a day, warm on the sand with Billy Piper. I'd give it all up for a long lunch with Samantha Jones or even Annabelle Bronstein. Perhaps it's just that men monopolize. Men monopolize culture, and men monopolize entertainment, and men monopolize business. Men monopolize success itself. I can hear myself deriding rom-coms and romance, deriding pink but still wearing it, deriding the saccharine sweetness of cute dresses, deriding the female experience. And it's not that I don't love those things, that I don't think they deserve an equal footing, but this is a society that praises the male forms of strength and resilience, stacking them above all else. I need to watch out for that inadvertent lean into the dominance of men. Though I can see the fallible truth of men, I can still feel the discrepancy in my approach. I can pen columns that poo-poo masculinity, revealing its myriad and laughable flaws. I can even write books. I can critique masculinity. I can see its moving parts. I can muddle through the privileged maze, but every so often I catch myself. I'm like a babysitter in a horror film, realizing that the phone call is coming from inside the house. I am the man obsessed with men. What a revelation. Raven Smith's Men was written and read by Raven Smith, abridged by Robin Brooks, produced by Naomi Walmsley, edited by Gav Murchie, the sound engineer was Shane O'Byrne, researcher was Rosalind Gibson. Raven Smith's Men was recorded at the Sound House.